inspiring for many of us in other parts of the world that are working in indigenous conservation, environmental justice, and climate change action, and grateful for the folks who are here, who are attracted to a discussion on this topic. And I really look forward to learning from the others that are here to share and who are able to share in the meeting. So a lot of my work, stems from trying to figure out what's happening with climate change from a Potawatomi or a Anishinaabe perspective. And Anishinaabe people, we're an indigenous people from North America, and we have many, many tribal nations within the Anishinaabe world. And so a lot of our communities originally center in what's called the Great Lakes region, which is one of the world's largest areas of fresh water, and is spanning the United States and Mexico. But we have hundreds of Anishinaabe tribal nations within that area. But we also have many Anishinaabe communities that were forcibly relocated pretty far away as well. Whether that's in different parts of what's currently Canada, or known as Canada, or even really southern areas like what's currently known as Kansas or Oklahoma in the context of the U.S. And some Anishinaabe people even relocated to what's currently Mexico in different parts of our history as well. So from our perspective, I very much tried to understand how we can grapple with climate change as a larger indigenous community that we know now, not only from our own knowledge, but from what scientists say, that we're among the communities that are going to be hit the hardest by a number of climate change impacts. Flooding and water quality impacts, changes in temperature, changes in precipitation. These are all tremendously dangerous for the sustenance of our cultures, our economies, our family life, and many, many other factors. And so indigenous people, we're among the most active people all over the world, not just Anishinaabe people, we're all over the world, among the most active, trying to take action to address climate change, whether how to mitigate it, how to promote renewable energy, how to adapt to it, how to make plans and prepare. And so in the context of this work, I've really endeavored to kind of get our voices out there as indigenous people. And along the way, there's been a number of things that have come to mind and that I've sought to express. So one of the things is that we have to stop this bizarre assumption that climate science is a new science. It might be new for some groups of people. And we have to get rid of this idea that climate change or climate science itself is somehow tracking changes that are best characterized as unprecedented or completely novel. And so I wanted to say a couple of things about why I think that, because I don't know that the sentences I just said are immediately clear. So the first thing is that for a number of indigenous people, if we were to ask a lot of our ancestors, what do you think about climate science? They'd probably respond, they'd say, well, if you look at our traditions going back many, many hundreds of years, all of our social, political, cultural traditions never excluded climate change as a topic. So for example, indigenous political philosophies and really ancient ones, like ones that we would say are centuries old, they were all about how you need to organize a society to be adaptive and responsive to a constantly changing environment, whether that's seasonal change or longer term trends in change. So something like the climate system. And so it's really hard to find an indigenous philosophy out there. And I've heard from many indigenous people in other parts of the world too, it's really hard to find an indigenous philosophy out there that doesn't understand the fabric of society as already involved with trying to understand what it means to live with a climate, to adapt to climate change, and to be prepared for severe climate events, including unexpected ones. And so I would say that today we currently call things like scenario planning, what we currently call, in certain scientific fields, social and ecological systems. That's all there in a lot of indigenous thought. And it's pretty sad, actually, that colonialism and racial capitalism and other forms of discrimination like patriarchy and ableism put a halt to our being able to grow our traditions more publicly. And instead, we've had to really locate them within our communities and practice them at a smaller scale. And what I think is important to note is, at least for Anishinaabe people in our traditions, the study of climate change is actually the study of society. There's no such thing as, I'm going to study climate change, and then after I study it, I'm going to worry about whether humans can mobilize to do something about it. Actually, the study of climate change is the study of how humans can mobilize, cope, work together, and resolve conflicts to manage everyday, severe, and unexpected forms of risk. So if you look in different indigenous people's stories, including ancient ones that are about situations where people had to grapple with different types of environmental and climate change, the morals of those stories are never the discovery of a new technology. They're always that actually society needed to figure out, well, wait a minute, we got in this mess in the first place because there was conflict and inequity. And so we needed to repair and restore our fabric to be able to respond to climate change. So in this way, the larger climate science field that includes all of these traditions is actually one that doesn't have that exclusion and that separation of physical climate change and then society. It just is about the study of society. So there's no such thing as climate science and climate justice. There's just climate justice that wraps up everything. And we never would have gotten into this predicament that the ivory tower of science has played such a problematic role. It's both prevented communities from being able to work collaboratively with scientists, but it's also exposed a fissure that climate science was unable to respond as effectively as was needed to deal with the forces that want to deny that climate change is an issue. And so it's certainly not the fault of climate scientists that there's skepticism out there, but it's telling that scientific institutions have not been able to respond and take care of that issue as swiftly as they ought to have. Another issue we face, before I wrap up my comments here, is that the idea that human-caused climate change is unprecedented is, to put it mildly, a very unempathetic way to talk about climate change. It's actually very revealing because, for example, in any part of the world, I guarantee it, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but actually colonialism and racial capitalism, they involved the harmful infliction of different forms of environmental and climate change on the people being colonized and exploited. So for example, indigenous people in North America, 200 years ago, we were on the front lines of the Industrial Revolution. The fossil fuel industries, the dirty industries, would have never been able to take root as swiftly as they have. They would have never been able to have such an impact and footprint in the atmosphere if they hadn't have taken advantage of the non-consensual displacement and dispossession of our lands. And so we experienced the pollution, the relocation, the shrinkage of our territories, and that literally causes climate change. It changes soils, it changes ground cover, changes water quality, it completely terraforms the land. My own community in the 19th century had to walk like 1,000 miles on the trail of death to a completely new ecosystem, and then just completely start over after having been in one area for many, many generations. That's all human-caused climate change. And so the fact that people want to talk about the current climate change issue as unprecedented is actually just a reflection that certain privileged people are now feeling the potential for the risks to their ways of life. But for many of our communities, we've battled these risks and these problems for generations. And the current climate change ordeal, in which our communities are again among those who are most at risk, is a continuation of everything that was happening before. So we face the issue that we both experienced excessive levels of pollution and ecosystem degradation to make way for the causes of human-caused climate change, and we're also on the front lines of the impacts of it. And the last thing I'll mention is that in a lot of the political work happening, we're finding out another fact, which is that the reason why many of our communities are vulnerable to climate change is not because we happen to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's actually because the product of having been dispossessed of our lands, and our lands having been shrunk, and our governance having been disrespected and not acknowledged by nation states, that's what makes it hard for our communities to adapt. That's what makes it hard for our communities to be leaders in mitigating climate change through adopting renewable energy solutions. And in some recent publishing I've done, as well as in some of the government work, we've really been pointing out that actually land dispossession and the degradation of tribal governance is a cause of vulnerability. It's not just a brute climate change impact that hits a community in the wrong place at the wrong time due to bad luck. And so if we don't address land dispossession, if we don't restore tribal sovereignty and indigenous people's self-determination, then there will be no better future for indigenous people. What at best we would have is a future where privileged people enjoy the benefits of a certain form of clean energy or mitigation, and everybody else gets exposed to harms caused by many of the solutions to climate change and being cut out of the new energy sector. Anyways, thanks for having the chance to share.
Thanks, Kyle. Hopefully you can come back, because there'll no doubt be loads of questions, comments that will come your way. So thank you so much. And I'm hearing that in your much more integrated understanding, climate debates cannot be extricated from land debates, and tenure rights to land. So the social and the environmental really go hand in hand, and it's only the sort of the elitist colonial understanding has led to this fractured way of thinking. And perhaps that is so because that exclusion prevents communities from, as you say, taking action and becoming responsible for what we call solutions, and limiting the agency to a very kind of exclusive group of people. But certainly the land, the connection with land, is something that resonates really strongly with some of the work I'm doing currently with the Tenure Facility, which is all about granting tenure and rights to Indigenous peoples as a step towards climate, so-called climate solutions. So land has propped up as a key connection here, and it's the second theme. And thanks, Kyle, for doing such wonderful weaving already, that climate and land are not disconnected, and the way we live and practice our lives with the land are part of the so-called solution to this crisis. With that in mind, I'd like to invite Janet, whose work is very much about local communities working with for the land, and for her to give us some of her insights into how that connection with the land and land-based living becomes a way of knowing and understanding climate change. Janet, thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for the opportunity to also get to share a bit during this webinar. I will quickly try to share a few slides, just a very few. And this is in particular, as it helps me to get to tell everyone about Sustainable Agriculture Tanzania, the organization I work with. And so we are basically a local non-government organization in Tanzania. We work with farmers in the Morogoro region, also in Dodoma, in Arusha, Lindi, Mtwara, as well as Tabora. Our work is mostly with small-scale farmers, but we also work a lot with indigenous groups of people, including the Maasai pastoralists. Also, we work with the Waluguru people who are natives of the Uluguru Mountains in Morogoro. Our vision is that majority of farmers are using acknowledged agroecological methods to improve their livelihoods, conserve the environment, and reduce pressure on natural resources. So this is our joint vision as an organization, and for the farmers we work with. I like this picture very much. On the picture, this is Mama Messi Mena, and her farm, originally this was really just completely open field, completely open field, and they will just plant one crop during the rainy season, and that was about it. But now this farm, which is heavily visited by people to go and learn, because at the moment she's been able to really turn it into a very productive farm that has crops throughout the year. So she has trees. This is Albizia lebec that you see. This is hibiscus. She also has introduced bananas, and underneath, which we don't see very well on the picture, she has sweet potatoes that cover the soil. And the system is really resilient and sustains the household throughout the year at the moment. And it's only in the fourth year now, since she started it about 2018. So I like this picture because it well features the vision of our organization, but also it shows really the big potential that agroecological systems of farming have to regenerate land, to restore degraded soils, but also to build resilience, not just for the household, but also for the area. And you see the area away, again, it's completely open. It's just a small grass cover on it. And when the dry season comes, of course, yes, you have very little crop cover. And I will not talk so much about this slide. This is our mission, but yes, here we see some of my colleagues packaging hibiscus harvested from the farmer. And we do a lot of work. Our network is with over, for last year, it was over 21,086 farmers that we work with, and 65% of them were women. So women are very central to the work we do. And this group picture shows the women, it shows the men, and it shows really the good relations that both men and women can have and also work together to achieve a common purpose. This picture here is seedlings these are tree seedlings, and this is cloves. They're ready for transplanting in the field. They were ready for transplanting in the field at this time. And we have our training center where we do most of the trainings for people who come from other regions of the country. And yes, here is a young farmer. She is harvesting. This is cardamom from the food forest. So we have really a multiple or manifold approach and different practices and techniques for climate resilience, but also for producing different food and crops for the household subsistence, for subsistence of the household, for nutrition, but also for the market. For example, this cardamom is for sale, and it earns a good income for the household. So we also publish a farmer magazine, and we distribute it to farmers all over the country. And we have a readership of over 90,000 farmers who get to read the magazine. In the magazine, we share information because we believe it's important to share information from different areas for farmers to get to read and also to see what farmers in other areas are doing. For example, information relevant to how farmers are adapting to climatic changes, the practices or adaptation practices that farmers are using, and what is working. Maybe it might inspire another farmer somewhere else to also get to see when they read the story and maybe try to practice as well in their area. This is an agroforestry system at our farmer training center. So you see we have the alleys with the big trees, but we also have the gliricidia trees, which we do coppicing, whereby we cut and then we plow them back into the soil for adding as biomass, and it helps to add the organic matter of the soil. It helps to increase the water holding capacity of the soil. And as a result, we get really crops growing, and even the moisture content of the soil is really improved with the more capacity to hold water. And it's important for crops to really grow and reach maturity, especially in areas like this. This is a dryland area, a dryland semi-arid area. We receive less than 500 millimeters of rainfall in this land. So also the type of farming and crop production practices that we use are really those that show resilience, because it's not easy to farm in such areas with only such little amount of rainfall. And also we do a lot of rainwater harvesting from the surface. So we harvest rainwater that falls on the surface of the land. We collect it into a water reservoir. We also harvest rainwater from the roofs and store it for use after the rainy season. But it shows really different ways on how, when it's raining, one can really harvest and store the precious water. And also practices like using swales, charcoal dams for water storage, also sand dams, and how they really help to reduce also erosion. Because if you don't have a proper design of the farm, when it rains, there's a lot of water that comes down with the rain. But if the water is not well channeled, it can cause a lot of destruction by eroding the soil and leaving gullies and contributing to environmental degradation. But when the water is harvested properly, it can be really well stored and used during a time when water is scarce and there is no water. And this is a picture with some Maasai women. As I said, we're a very inclusive organization and we work with indigenous groups of people. So we work a lot also with the Maasai community in adaptation, especially due to the changing climatic conditions. Right now in Tanzania, we have a very long drought period. And so we work on practices that enable pastoralists who are cattle keepers, but also who some move with the cattle, that they're able to plan ahead and also forecast in terms, also when it comes that there is a long drought, for example, that the severity is not highly impacting them. So these women here are harvesting seeds. So if you see the hands, this is seed harvesting. She's harvesting seed and putting on her cloth. Also, the woman on the back, her hand is on the fabric. She's putting seeds from this grass, so they can further propagate and get more of this grass growing, and then cattle will have good grass to eat. And also, this grass is quite tolerant to drought. So it's quite ideal and practical for these areas where the pastoralists live. So we work with young people, and here we have crop production, also spice production, and also integration of livestock, especially small livestock like chicken, also goats. And also, yes, we work on basic life skills for the young people to understand themselves, to set objectives and targets. But since the type of farming that we train them is really on agroecological methods of food production, which provide positive benefits for the environment, these young people have opportunities to employ themselves in agroecological production of food. And as a result, they get decent earnings from food production, selling of the food, also adding value of the food. And at the same time, since they don't use synthetic fertilizers or agrochemicals, and they also actually plant trees, then they're contributing positively to the environment. This picture, I really tried to get a better picture, but it was not possible. But this is a compost pile, because here I talk about compost, some of the sustainable land management practices that farmers are using in Morogoro. So we have terracing. This is making terraces and channeling, so water can, to reduce soil erosion, but also to make sure that the nutrition in the soil stays in the soil. The picture on the right-hand side, these are terraced fields. It's a satellite image from Google Earth, and it's supposed to show terraced fields on the slopes of the Uluguru mountain, but they are not very well seen because of the resolution. And we do a lot of agroforestry. Farmers do a lot of agroforestry. Green manuring, this is the planting of legumes like lablab, mukuna, and both edible legumes and non-edible legumes, and then plowing them back into the soil so as to improve on the soil nutrition. Also making compost like we see on the pile, making botanical extracts for top dressing as well as booster, and also for pest control. And this is done mostly from trees and plants. So a lot of trees are planted also for getting botanical extracts to deal with pests and disease control. And integrated agriculture approach, whereby I think I mentioned also with the small livestock and forestry, which is a very important component of our work. Now, this picture is from the, it's a picture that shows really a forest, a forest or a farm, a food forest coming up. So we have some trees here. As you see, they're not so big yet, but they're coming on very well. And we have the bananas inside in the system. And really, this was originally just a completely open field. But we say with agroecological methods and agroforestry, it's really possible to have such integrated fields. And I end here on the slides, but maybe to add a bit, since we believe in working and keeping really the communities at the center of our work, we do participatory climate risk assessments, whereby we work with the communities, we develop together also implementation plans for the identified. So once we identify the different climate and disaster risks in the area and the severity of climatic change, then the community also comes up with plans on how they can reduce the severity and what methods they can use so as to adapt to the changing climate. And then we train them in these methods that the community has indicated that they will be willing to adapt or to use so as to build resilience, so as to reduce the negative effects on the environment. For example, using compost, planting more trees, and we will do trainings on tree nursery establishment, transplanting of trees, management of the trees to make sure that the trees are growing and are able to reach maturity. Also, yes, the issues of excessive rainfall and floods, droughts, excessive wind, and how we can really reduce the severity of these weather conditions. So I wanted to add a bit also on those few points, and I think I stop here. I will be around, so if there are questions coming up, I'll be happy to listen to and also join in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. That was lovely. And again, as always, so inspiring and so kind of down to earth. One of the things that I feel sometimes frustrated when we hear about climate change in the media and in political sectors is that it's so removed from the everyday practice of putting food on the table, community life, sharing, family life, and yet the two don't need to be separated. And I guess what Sustainable Agriculture Tanzania does is show how when communities organize themselves, when they work as community, when they work as a collective and with the land, the practices for a climate-friendly life are possible in those kind of everyday and straightforward lifestyles, as opposed to the kind of the complexity of some of the political and top-down narratives, which are so disembodied, so lacking in that kind of community-based understanding. So thank you so much, Janet, and hopefully we'll have some questions and conversation in a sec. But I guess it ties in really nicely the idea that Kyle was mentioning earlier about the importance of working with communities, with land, and not separating the climate debate from a lifestyle with communities and the social aspect of environmental work. And as you were showing those images, it also elicited in me the idea that how important it is to kind of embed this knowledge in actual practices and not just intellectual debate in farming as a physical work of working with the land and performing certain techniques like composting and manuring and whatnot, which is a physical work and which has a physical impact on the land and therefore a real climate effect, as opposed to just talking about it and writing policy and whatnot. So I want to now shift one step further and talk about that kind of importance of physical practices and physicalizing our understanding of climate change and performing physical practices that are eco-friendly and which perhaps adopt a more kind of climate-oriented lifestyle. So I'm inviting Alex to give us the final intervention of tonight before we open the forum and hopefully we do a roundtable. Alex, you were telling me when last we spoke that you thought climate change was very, very much tied with a kind of hyperactivity and a way of living where our brains are heating up and we're too stuck on our minds and we're not physicalizing this enough. Would you care to kind of show us what you mean or tell us what you mean by that, how we can become less cerebral when engaging with climate?
Absolutely, Nick. Yeah. Just check first of all, you can hear me. I've put my AirPods in. I think we're good. But yeah, first of all, just a huge thanks to you, Nick, and Guardians Worldwide, and also to be here with Kyle and Janet as well. And thanks to the tenure for enabling all this. And hi everybody. I actually think it would be really good to do some practice, some kind of ecosomatic practice, as well as like talk while we walk kind of thing, and just get a feel for some of the work I'd love to introduce, and just to extend the thanks to the Taoist embodied culture teachers that I've been fortunate to work with since the 1980s, teachers from China and in China, also from the UK and the USA and lots of other countries. I've been very privileged to have visited people who have shared their gifts of wisdom, culture with me, and also all the people at Intercultural Roots as well, that are enabling our work on arts for health and social change. So I'm gonna kind of jump into my other camera just so that I can lead a few exercises and invite people, if you are comfortable, to switch your cameras on, and then it's really nice in gallery view to see one another and be interactive and connected. So I'm going to spotlight my other camera now. There we go. And kind of just set one or two things up. You can remain seated while we perform this beautiful practice. I'm going to bring three kind of exercises and kind of talk a little bit while we do them. And the first one is kind of very respectful practice, working with the sun and the stars, the kind of the heavens, and then working with the rain and water and wind, so a connection to nature, and then a third exercise that connects to the land, to the earth, and it relates very much to the Taoist kind of concept of Jing, Qi, and Shen, which you could consider as being like our physical body, our energy body, and our spirit body. So let's start with, first of all, this beautiful exercise that is about connecting to the sun. So I'll go through the movements, and please just feel free to copy. You can do this seated or standing. Just be attentive to your body and be kind and don't overdo anything. Okay. So as I said, this practice is about the sun. So you can kind of envision, if you like, the sun rising and kind of reaching up into the sky and lifting my heels off the floor and tickling the sky with my fingers. And it's very much connects to the notion of like ideas and creativity, and thoughts and intention. So Shen, or spirit. And I'm just going to keep repeating these movements while I talk. And please join in, tickle the eyes at the back of the head. And so where the hands connect, they're also connecting through our heart. So the fire of our heart, connecting to the sun, the heart to the hands. And the idea being that the earth is overheating, it's observable, and all the record-breaking temperatures and the fires that are contributing to climate crisis. But also, you know, there's issues, so many social issues that we're experiencing of injustice and people perhaps overthinking, egotistic ambition, greed, pursuit of desire over our needs and wants, profits and power. All these things in traditional Chinese medicine are considered too yang, too excessive, or yang. You know, like we like to be warm, but not too hot, not to have a fever, not to burn. So things like racial and domestic violence and abuse, inequalities of food and water and health, mental health, disease, oppression, or perhaps all evidence that there's a perpetuating imbalance, that things perhaps need cooling, that too much fire in the heart heats the head and can lead not to joyfulness from the heart, but can lead to mania. And that fire requires fuel in order to burn, and that sometimes this can create a wildfire that's out of control. So notion maybe that we should be careful what we ask for with our intention, with our ideas, that profit comes with a cost. I'm going to move on to a second practice, which is about the rain and the cycles of nature. So if I imagine there's a big pool of water, and just raising this water, the sun, the heat of the sun evaporating the water, transforming it from liquid to gas, to clouds, vapor above the head, where the water above the mountains cools and freezes, and maybe it creates snow or glaciers and ice on top of the mountain. And for a moment, if we let our hands rest on the top of the head, on the 100 meeting point, the heat from the head begins to melt the water, allows it to run down through the body, the wells and springs, streams, rivers and seas, flowing towards the big ocean of our center, just allowing our hands to touch our body. There's something very beautiful about these cycles, this transformation that naturally occurs in so many elements of nature. The cycles of water, the seasons, night and day, the balance. So this movement also represents and cultivates a sense of harmony, that things are not necessarily in opposition, but complement one another. Things that flow between matter and spirit in every movement. Dr. Alex Fung says that nature is not our friend, that we have a responsibility and a care and to respect for ourselves and everything that's in our environment, if we are to live well, not to hinder or harm or hurt. And often people perceive this disconnection, that there's a disconnection perhaps between body and mind or between people and places. And yet in the Taoist and traditional Chinese medicine traditions, there's a theories of the 5 phases and the 8 directions that really bring us to a place of really considering the relationship of our micro, our individual personal life, and the collective, the macro, or the situation that we're in, and that we can influence our environment. We can turn things around. The fire and the water can transform. Perhaps something about economy. It's not all about money. It's not all about GDP and growth, that we can learn to live frugally, not using all the finite resources. And the third practice that I would like to bring is about the earth, the land. And it relates to the Jing, our physical body, taking only what's needed and what can be replenished. So if we bring our thumb and index finger to touch, almost like creating a triangle. And if we look down through this triangle to the earth, and then press down to the earth as we sink, respectfully bring the yang towards the yin, grasping the earth, recognizing the nourishing qualities of the earth as we draw earth energy to our center, connecting to the energy of nature, to the heavens, bringing all those energies together like 3 little fish swimming in the big ocean. There's an indigenous Brazilian called Elton Krenak, and in his booklet that's now in English, it's called Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. He says that the pandemic is a terrible thing, and yet it's hopeful for humanity, that the virus is discriminating against humanity for a reason. Perhaps like a mother teaching her children a lesson. In a podcast I was listening to recently, there was a stockbroker who said that oil is the lifeblood of the economy. And I thought to myself, no, it's the black blood of the earth. So, is the climate crisis an environmental crisis, or is it a people crisis? The earth is resilient and will bounce back. And we are in a micro and a macrocosmic kinship with our environment, our situation, with the land, with nature, and with the sky. It's our ancestry. It's what we're made from, and it's where we will return. It's sacred and divine. And these are complex ecologies that will determine the existence or the extinction of humanity. Perhaps we need to look at ourselves, the harmony between people and places. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for bringing us into the body. And thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Janet, for being open and sharing your experience, your ideas, your feelings. This is an open climate space for an open sharing of how we live in times of so-called crisis. But I guess, as you were saying, Alex, it's also a time of change, regeneration, and there's something exciting about living in the age we live, because it's a crux. It's the moment where, as a human race, we have to dig in and find the best of us to bounce back, as you say. And I think it was really special to see all three of you opening up and sharing perspectives that can help us bounce back. And hopefully we can weave them, we can connect them. So the importance of indigenous land and indigenous cosmovisions, the importance of local communities that work with the land, and the importance of actually thinking from our bodies, because our bodies ultimately are made of air, as you say, of the materials of this planet. And it's through this embodied way of thinking that we perhaps connect most deeply with our own planet. So thank you, all three of you. I'd like to open up the space now for a for a proper forum, and for people to throw in their ideas and to be open about how they feel and how they've been coping with the crisis. So if there are any comments right now, any responses or questions to our speakers, we can begin that. We've got half an hour. Gabriel.
Hi, thank you. Is it all right to ask a question to one person?
Sure.
Yeah, great. I was really looking forward to everyone, but Janet, thank you so much for your presentation. I was really looking forward to hearing it. Yeah, I was involved in some agroforestry projects in Pemba in the second half of the 90s. and it was a charity, a small charity from London with money from the public, so not a government thing at all. And definitely when it started out, it was sort of managed top end by English people, and then there was a slow transition to everything being run by Pemban men and women, really. And I think just what I wanted to ask was, I'm assuming you're a Tanzanian organisation, and do you think there's room for those kind of foreign organisations to be involved, or do you think they actually cause more problems?
Thank you, Gabriel. Well, you see, Tanzania, yes, Tanzania is Tanganyika, and then of course we have the islands, Zanzibar, and Unguja and Pemba, where you have been. And for me, I believe, collaborations, networking, and building relations, working together is very important. And especially when it comes to this issue of climate change and climate action. So it's a thing that not one single community or one single country, one single organization can do. So for open collaboration and engaging, and yes, so also our government is quite open, is quite open also with, we have international organizations, but also that are already existing, but if there are new ones as well, they really can come in and further collaborate and work. I think Tanzania is quite open. Recently, there's been also a revision in the law that for foreign people, so it's even more years, foreign people, expatriates can stay and live in Tanzania for a longer time than it was in the past as well. So this is really bringing in opportunities and also that security or safety for foreign people and foreign organizations to work in Tanzania. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriel. Do we have any other interventions, comments, questions? There's Azure. Do you want to come in?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really beautiful to hear and witness like the weaving of insights from all four of you, and the collective here as well. I have a question that maybe you could help with. Maybe it's more of a dilemma or less than a question. So I live in the UK, in London, and I'm fortunate enough to have a partner who owns a flat in London. And we've been thinking about leaving the city finally and moving to nature in order to liquidate the price of a flat in London and protect forests in some part of the world where you can convert a flat to many acres of land that you can then steward or protect from like mining companies or logging companies or animal agriculture, etc. So I have found a piece of land in Costa Rica, and I have an ethical, like moral issue about buying land because it feels like a new type of colonizing mindset. But at the same time, I want to help because I know that if I don't buy it, someone else who's less conscious about, like, perhaps less conscious about protecting the land will buy it and potentially log the forest or do something worse than just conserving the forest. So do you know of any like legal frameworks in which you could buy the land, protect the land, or give it to the indigenous people of like that nation or that era without the land being then able to be sold on to a next higher bidder, because basically my intention is to protect the land. So I don't know. I just wanted to put it out there because I'm sure other people from cities, conscious eco hippies often have the dream of like moving to nature, and this is maybe coming up for other people as well. So thank you for listening, and I hope that is relevant to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Asir. Kyle, do you want to come in there? How would you respond to that? The purchase of territories, especially indigenous territories, with the intention to give it to the indigenous guardians. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways to look at it, and it depends on the situation. If it's an area that diverse indigenous people are already practicing stewardship on, they're exercising different forms of sovereignty and self-determination, then the process has to be directly with representatives from that community. And sometimes that can be a challenge if, like, for example, in the United States, and it's different in all parts of the world, but like in the US context, we want to be treated as governments and our own nations. And so the capacity to be able to work with private property owners, has to reflect the importance of the nation-to-nation relationship as the way that we want to be treated. But regardless, there's different mechanisms and ways in which you can start working with different staff or other representatives of indigenous people to make that relationship. Now, if it's an area of land that has, been greatly affected by colonialism, and the actual and original, custodians, indigenous people of that land are quite distanced from it, not in their memories and actual ways of thinking about it, but in terms of their capacity to engage directly in land stewardship. There are, it depends on the nation, but there are a ton of different types of legal instruments for being able to create the situation that you want. So like in the US context, for example, there's multiple forms of conservation easements and conservation trusts and so on, where people with the goals you have are able to purchase the land and then create a legal, binding agreement that regardless of what you or other people do in the future, certain practices are protected into perpetuity, and that you could actually be the one that purchases the land, but it's largely controlled by the indigenous people. So you'd actually be able to give up that, control that you're concerned about. But again, in that process, there'd still have to be that brokering and diplomacy with the indigenous people, or in other contexts with other Black and Brown communities in the global North or in the global majority. So yeah, I think there's a lot of options, and there's certainly a lot of material available, but the legal aspects do depend on the actual kind of conservation, easement, and trust laws in particular nations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Azure. I'm gonna jump to Danny in a second, but just to say that worth looking at the Tenure Facility. They are a Stockholm-based NGO that is devoted to the purchase of land and land tenure for indigenous peoples in 12 different countries. And what Kyle has said is very much chiming in with the organization I work with. And the voice coming in from the territorial communities is that economic or financial investment in the territories does not necessarily have to do with land purchase, but with capacity building, investing in the communities themselves so that they can have the capacity to run their own projects and be the custodians of the land, because there are financial implications to being a guardian. If you're part of an economic, political, ecclesiastical system, you have to basically pay to be a guardian. So sometimes it's not only about purchasing a land, but also supporting indigenous community groups and organizations to be able to be administratively sustainable, and to be able to bid for funds And so the capacity is really important. Also, the granting of rights is really important, and that has economic costs. The granting of tenure, and then the actual implementation of tenure rights. So once an indigenous group has rights over the land, you still have to invest in protecting the land and managing the land. So sometimes investment is not on the land, but on the communities themselves and their needs for capacity, and it's worth thinking about that. How you might want to support an indigenous organization that is custodian of the land as opposed to purchasing the land. That's another way of looking at that dilemma, Asir. I don't know if that's helpful. But the name of the organization is the Tenure Facility, if you want to have a look at it. And we at Guardians are also supporting various indigenous guardians in the Atlantic forest around capacity building and also land tenure. So we can speak about that if you're interested. Sorry, there was a question there from Katie. Katie, would you like to come in? Sorry, I'm just looking at random hands. I'm going for Katie and then Danny. Katie.
Hiya. Yeah, thank you all for your talks. They were all really, really interesting. I have quite a big question, I think, to all of you. And I was wondering if any of you have any comments or could speak to interspecies understanding and connection, and maybe what that means to you.
Alex, would you like to respond to that? Interspecies, how would a Taoist tradition perhaps think that through or physicalize that, our relationship beyond the human or the more than human?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's a great question. In fact, I remember when I did my PhD, my kind of defense of my dissertation, one of the panelists asked me something similar. Said, you know, you're walking through the forest and you encounter a boulder. How does the boulder affect you? How does it speak to you? And I must admit, I was kind of a little bit stumbled by that at first, but then, you know, began to recognize about, you know, the ecologies that exist, that we do affect our situation and environment, and our environment does affect us, you know, that there is this kind of correlation. And Dr. Alex Fung, who's one of the Taoists I work with, he has a clinic in Oakland in California. And he often talks about everything kind of that has got energy, that has got chi, in many ways is an interrelation also. You know, you particularly said, you know, interspecies, which is really open, and I think that's beautiful. And you know, people we're beginning to recognize, you know, the interrelation of all species and the whole kind of metabolism, you know, that exists. You know, I kind of think about my own kind of practice as being this like whole body practice. You know, that there are interrelated elements of ourself, of our body, our mind, our spirit, but at the same time we are in constant communication and, you know, with everything that's around us. So yeah, and I think, yeah, that's probably all I'd want to say at the moment. Yeah, we communicate and, you know, are interrelated many different levels, you know, whether it's yeah, body, mind, spirit, intention, consciousness. Yeah.
Janet, would you like to say something briefly about that? I'd imagine that sustainable ecology relies on the co-participation of other species, pollinators, birds, larger animals that may be important in terms of eating certain seeds and germinating seeds. I guess agroecology is all about a participation of non-human animals, fungi, in the process of a sustainable and climate-friendly practice. Am I right?
Yes, thank you. You are right, and there's even there's a lot of literature as well as illustrations that really show this cycle and the interrelations and interconnectedness of different species and elements, from those that are visible to the eye to those that you cannot see with the naked eye. You know, the bacteria, fungi, to all these small insects and to organisms, microorganisms, to bigger species and creatures. And there's really a lot of interconnectedness. And for me, personally, I say it's really working with nature is very intelligent. It's very intelligent because you see all these different species and other living things, also the plants, the behavior of the plants, and being able to work with them all in a peaceful, harmonious way is something very, very good. And also I had wanted to contribute on the question of Azure on land tenure, access to land, ownership of land, also for indigenous people. I think countries have different ways on how land ownership is done. For us in Tanzania, this year, since really the land issue is serious, it's a serious issue. Many indigenous people and many farmers, even who occupy land, most of them do not really have ownership of the land. They don't have any paper documentation to show that they own this land. So they're actually in a very risky situation because they do not have that right of ownership of this land, though they occupy on it and they say this is my land, and maybe the neighbors recognize them as owners of the land. And we've seen in the past where issues of land grabbing and also, you know, investors coming in and land has to be taken from the people because an investor has to invest in the land and things like that. So this year we piloted with a few in a community where at least about 450 people could get customary certificates of rights of occupancy. So this is it becomes then a legal document that recognizes these people occupying the land as owners of that land, and that provides also security for them. And we saw it works very well, but again, it's time intensive, also it's resource intensive to work through all these processes. Also, it's very knowledge intensive because the land has to be surveyed and, you know, with geographical, with this GPS and so many other things. But indeed, it's very empowering for the communities once they get these certificates, and it's an assurance of ownership. So it's just one example for countries like Tanzania, and maybe in other countries where they don't have such arrangements for local people and for farmland, then this will be an approach which one can use to get also communities and local people having access and ownership to their land. Yeah.
Thanks, Janet. We've got 15 or so minutes, so there's still time for a few more questions. Danny, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. So this is a question mainly for Alex Boyd. Thank you for your presentation. I just wondered if you'd found ways to practice ecological consciousness with groups and communities and how that works, and whether you could talk a little bit about that. And yeah, I'm just thinking about how much Taoism, apologies if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, can kind of speak to people in an everyday context, you know, because it might be seen as something quite esoteric or distanced from people in a sort of everyday context. So I was just wondering if you'd managed to work in that way.
Hey, thanks, Danny. It's a great question, and it really, you know, is important. I work a lot in embodied research, and often I'm saying to my peers and colleagues in the kind of scholarly academia world, how does this benefit people, the public, communities, or does the work just stay in some kind of peer-reviewed journal? How can it actually get to the people that can really benefit from it? And in the 2000s, I spent about 11 years taking my practice and getting it kind of accredited, like, in the UK, so we could then resource funding in order to, take projects out into communities. So we spent 10, 11 years, we drew down quite a lot of money and worked with a lot of different communities, like young people who've been excluded from education, travelers and migrant communities, as well, like older people, and and it was bringing this practice to them in ways that benefited them, in terms of health, but also in terms of inclusion. But I think for me personally, it's really been in the last 10 years or so that I've really appreciated this kind of ecological, kind of ecosomatic connection. And it's not only Taoist practices that can bring this about. Many traditional knowledge communities and indigenous communities around the world work, in these ways as well. And I think there's something very much in responding to your question that isn't about technique. It isn't about the movement or doing something. It's a kind of process of becoming. Like I consider that there's a difference between someone who's practicing something or doing a technique and someone who has a practice. And I think there, it's very much about a consciousness, that it isn't only the practice, but also the ethic and the values that the practice imbues, the philosophy of that as well. So, and this can have a really deep impact on not only an individual's consciousness, but also collective psychology as well, if it's brought to groups and communities, and that can have real impact then on environments and situations, because you bring that focus to everything that you do. Not only the kind of the technique and doing the movement forms, but to everything, to recognizing that kind of interrelation in everything that we interact with, whether it's people or the environments that we're in. So
when we had a conversation around this, Alex, I was thinking about the connection with indigenous perspectives on climate change, at least the ones that I have shared with indigenous friends in the territories, where the idea that climate change, as Kyle was saying before, is something removed from social well-being and community well-being is not really part and parcel of their life. So I was chatting to Alex Melinir from the Pehuenche community in southern Chile, and he was just talking of climate change as Mapukusan, the disease of the earth. It's a disease, and when we understand climate change as a disease, I guess the way forward is healing, and it's not so much about some removed abstract economic political solution, but a looking into social life and personal life, and as Kyle said at the very beginning, changing the way we live. And the diseased way we live, and understanding it as a disease we're carrying at a social but also at a physical level. So I think the somatic perspective kind of grounds us in understanding perhaps of what's going on as a well-being health issue, not so much as a kind of global industrial political issue, which it also is, but that removes us from any responsibility, any agency, and any kind of deep connection. Kyle, am I making any sense in your eyes? Is in your opinion the climate change debate something that can be connected to health, to well-being at the social and personal level?
Well, what we've seen is that even judged on its own terms and on its own criteria, the industrial sort of political, narrow economic approach is actually not going to deliver. And again, even if we just think of it on its own criteria, I mean, for example, one of the major United States policy that's part of the Biden-Harris administration's domestic climate agenda is called the Justice 40 Initiative, which is based on the idea that with the hundreds of billions of dollars on federal spending for climate change, and in the current bill that's about to pass, there's $555 billion tied to climate change mitigation. And there were previous spending on this as well in the billions of dollars, but 40% of the benefits of those investments have to accrue to disadvantaged communities. But when it comes to actually implementing that, how is that going to occur when you're grafting brute resource allocations onto communities that have experienced injustice for generations? They've experienced disinvestment for generations. And we're finding that the government has never tried to do this before. So it's not even organized to be able to do this. And so essentially, climate change has been studying the wrong thing. Climate science has been studying the wrong things. They haven't been studying the types of social fabrics that would be needed to make solutions count for everybody. Now, in terms of health, I think that's a critical topic because in my view, and I know ecological consciousness can mean a lot of different things, but there's actually no such thing as an individual ecological consciousness. Certainly practices of ecological consciousness might have aspects that are best performed as individuals, but that assumes that the individual activities generate the accountability to the community that you're ultimately part of. And so for that reason, right, there really is no individual when we're thinking at the level of consciousness, and individuality is not the starting point. Including human subjectivity, the idea of assuming that one is first a human and then branches out into relations with plants and animals, right? For a lot of indigenous people back in the day, our ancestors would have never introduced themselves first as a human. They would have led in with their plant and animal and habitat relationships as a much better explicator of who they were. And so the health aspect actually refers directly to what it means to mobilize and empower communities. If we understand climate change as an issue of community health, we have to think about the community relationships, the kinship relationships. We have to think of the trauma. People in the climate change business are not used to talking about sustainability as healing. And in a lot of my work in my like college teaching, one of the points that I have made is that these discussions of sustainability, for most people in the world, indigenous people, people of the global majority, sustainability has always been about protecting our communities from forces of disempowerment. It's not about our communities trying to deal with an abstract environmental issue. We have a lot of wisdom on sustainability because we had to face the brute of industrialization, the brute force of industrialization. And I'm telling you, any society that's still around, having gone through several centuries of that, is one that I guarantee you has a lot to say about what it means to be sustainable. And so the social justice literature, the social work, right, which focuses a lot on healing and focuses a lot on dealing with trauma, and looks at that very practically in terms of community empowerment, whether in the policy sphere, the economic sphere, the cultural revitalization sphere. That is a literature on sustainability. And it's ironic that that literature and that history is not thought of as sustainability. Rather, people believe that sustainability started sometime in the 80s with the Brundtland Report. And so the health aspect is key because it's the collective health that is the way that we need to engage in climate science.
Thanks, Kyle. Thank you. We've got a few minutes left. Maya, you've got a question?
Yes, thank you. I hope it's not a too big question for the last minute. And thank you all very much for your valuable contributions. I was just thinking, because throughout the conversation, the word climate crisis was mentioned a couple of times without any, I think, further discussion about it. But yeah, I was just wondering how, from indigenous perspectives, we could navigate this word crisis, or kind of understand the productivities or dangers of that word. Because I think, for instance, in relation to the COVID crisis, this word crisis is allowing in many ways kind of the continuation and amplification of injustices and kind of harmful practices, dispossession, stuff like that. And I think the word crisis maybe also, I mean, as Kyle was saying, the dispossessions and adaptation to changes in climate has been going on for many more centuries than what we now conceive as the climate crisis of our time. And I think also in a way it kind of poses questions about wanting to emphasize the urgency of the climate crisis we live in, but also not sensationalize the issues that are going on, and also kind of respecting the nuances between victims and agent, between being a victim and being an agent for indigenous communities. And of course, there's many nuances between those concepts. But yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the word climate crisis and how we can navigate it in a respectful and just way, I suppose.
Kyle, would you like to come in?
Absolutely, I appreciate the question. And just super quickly, I think one of the ways to deal with the problematic usage of crisis is to look at how long the crisis is supposed to be understood in terms of its starting point. And it upsets me a lot, some of these conversations about crisis, like, for example, the fossil fuel sector for a long time has been associated with the human trafficking and sexual violence against indigenous people. It's been associated with massive levels of pollution and land dispossession. And for the climate justice activists that are now using things like the trafficking of indigenous women and girls in the man camps in the fossil fuel sector as a leverage point for climate justice, how come they weren't concerned about that like in the early 1900s? Right? That was a crisis then too. The crisis was bad then, and it's bad now. And I think the fact that people are now coming to focus on climate justice as a crisis, and this is similar to the point you made about COVID. What were they doing before? Did they think there wasn't a crisis before? I mean, this is the issue of COVID. People think it's a crisis. Wow, look at the crisis that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people face greater rates and horrible outcomes from COVID. Well, they weren't in crisis before to have gotten to the point where COVID affects them in that way. And what were people doing about that crisis? And so, I think that's kind of the crux of it, is when do people assume that the crisis started when they invoke the word crisis?
Thanks, Kyle. I think it's a great intervention, Maya, and I think I was discussing this with Matthew Fuller from Goldsmiths, how crisis elicits a very capitalist logic, because capitalism sort of depends on crisis, on the value gap that crisis generates. So wherever there's a crisis, there are new forms of economic value to be created, and the whole idea behind crisis management and manipulation of crisis very much subsumed within a capitalist logic that is making money out of this. So carbon trading and also, fossil fuel lobbying, green energy, they're all new opportunities for green capitalism and carbon capitalism to flourish. So yeah, I think it's a dangerous, risky word to be throwing around without qualifying the term and without critiquing and be critical about it, because as Kyle says, if this is a crisis, then we've always lived in crisis, because there's been a sedimentation of crisis, and there's been many different human and non-human induced climate changes in the past. So it's really important to define what we mean by crisis and not allow it to be co-opted by colonial discourse. So thank you very much for that intervention, Gaia. Anna, would you like to finish us off? You've got a question there, or is that just a thank you?
That was just a thank you. Living in the United States, Kyle, that was excellent. I live in New Mexico and I'm not there right now, but there's so many problems that the indigenous suffer from ever since, the colonization. And it's shocking how much it gets ignored. And it's really true that under COVID and climate, suddenly there's more spotlight on it, but there's so much more to do. I also wanted to speak to the young man, Azura, that wanted to buy the land, leave London. Do I have his name correct?
Yeah, it's Azur.
Azur. I don't know if you know this, Azur, but long ago, most of the indigenous were killed off in Costa Rica. There are probably Hispanic speaking people who might be considered the more recent indigenous, but Costa Rica is a kind of unique situation, well, in that it was very severe with its desecration of the indigenous population. So.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I promise we're going to finish at 5:30, and it's already 6:34, at least in London. It's probably a different time where you guys are. So I'd like to just say a couple of things before we finish off. We have a webinar, the next in this series, happening on the 17th of January. And we're going to be discussing more specifically the economic aspects and financial aspects of climate change, especially after the COP26 announcement that $1.7 billion will be pledged to action on the territories. So I'm going to put the link to the next webinar here on the chat if you guys are interested in joining us for that. We will be joined by Tuntia Katan, who is the coordinator of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, which oversees 5 major indigenous organizations in 4 different continents. An indigenous leader who has been very prominent in COP26 discussions with major governments and non-government organizations like the Jeff Bezos Earth Foundation, Bill Gates and others. And he's developed a model for indigenous community economy for financing of climate action, which we are sharing perhaps for the first time in a public space in January. It's called the Shandia model, and we're going to be talking about that. So you're all welcome to join us for that next session, or check the entire series on the Guardian's website. We've got some more of these talks going on over the next year. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Kyle, Alex, and Janet, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful interventions and comments. There was a question made earlier about what to do next. Alicia was saying this feels like a wonderful space with a lot of collective effort. What do we do taking this forth? Alicia, I don't know the answer to that. Guardians Worldwide is very much about that. For those of you who know our organization, we do events to create community. Some are physical communities, some are online communities. So you're welcome to join our upcoming courses and talks and stay in touch. But it's a really difficult one, what to do next. It's always the big question. Hopefully this session has given you some ideas or some inspiration about how to go about moving forward in this time of, I wouldn't call it crisis, just change, transformation, which is always exciting and enlivening. So thank you, everyone, for your time. Stay tuned and check our next session in January. It's going to be really, really insightful and exciting. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, night, wherever you are in the world. Stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.